Hi, and welcome to this Dynamic Boards NED Community Meetup. I'm Sarah, I'm the meeting host today. So our topic for today is gaining external assurance for the board. Our speaker is Trevor Pearce, and I met Trevor when we recorded a video with him about UK anti-doping, where he was chair and they were looking for new board members. Trevor has experience running large complex organisations. He has 40 years of experience in law enforcement, serving with Kent Police, National Crime Squad, Serious Organised Crime Agency and the National Crime Agency. Since then, he's been involved on the boards of a number of regulatory organisations, including UK Anti-Doping, as I mentioned, the Gambling Commission, and the National Lottery Commission. Trevor, over to you. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon all. Well, Sarah's given you the topic, and I thought it would just be useful for me to say a little bit about why do we think this topic might be one which is of interest to you as a group. And fundamentally, I think our view was that the growing complexity in regulatory, financial and operational environments means that the notion of external assurance to a board is more crucial than ever. Now, up front, I have to say that my own experience, other than some charity work, is on public sector boards. So it's very different, clearly, to private sector organisations. But I think these rules are applicable across those domains, whether it's third sector, public or private, because in today's climate, boards are facing this this requirement to demonstrate what they can do in relation to robust governance, risk management and control frameworks and how they operate. And I suppose, reflecting on the importance of that, it's worth just perhaps taking a moment, if you get the chance, to think about some of the outcomes from recent statutory public inquiries and just the level of interest and detail around board engagement that the leads of those inquiries have delved into. So I think it's just an important touchstone to think about, what's the arena that we're actually in and what are the challenges. So to explore where external assurance sits in all of this, I thought I'd just go back to the 3 lines of defence model. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but basically, first line of defence, management owns it, management manages the risk, and there should be self-assurance processes in place to ensure that what should be done is being done properly. Then clearly, second line of defence, where the frameworks within an organisation, such as risk management and compliance, are in place, and they're there to set those frameworks to carry out the assurance of the assurance. And I think importantly, depending on the size of the organisation, working with the executive and the non-executives in the development of the board assurance framework per se. There is a sort of a caveat to all of this, of course, which is that this is internal. And there are always dangers of whether it's cultural or systemic issues about the objectivity which comes through there, which of course leads on to the third line of defence. So, external assurance is therefore crucial, generally in relation, I guess, to those board assurance and framework processes. It's about the auditor, it's about independent consultants coming in to check and to assure about those first 2 lines of defence, and where you might need improvement and whether the controls, etc., are working. But also for me, external assurance is about, I suppose, independent verification by third parties about the effectiveness of clearly risk management practices and processes and governance arrangements, but also perhaps more generally about how the organisation is operating in order for the board to understand the environment and the challenges which it's facing and the responses to it. And so think about here about there's a wide array of services which are available: external audits, regulatory inspections, of which more later, board effectiveness reviews, certifications from industry bodies, and of course things like ISO arrangements and accreditation arrangements which can fall in place. So that can be a very broad and complex environment. And a couple of examples for me which at both ends of the scale, which I think indicate some of the challenges. So back in the Serious Organised Crime Agency, we were an organisation of about 4,500 people, £500 million budget, operating across the UK and in 40 different countries around the world in a number of challenging investigative and intelligence environments. So we had to have a high degree of robust risk management processes, both organisational and operational, in place. But on top of that, there were the regulatory overviews. So we had clearly external audit, National Audit Office, Health and Safety Executive, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, the then Office of Surveillance Commissioners, the then Office of Interception Commissioner, all of whom were able and had a regulatory role in relation to us, came in, did inspections, and did provide a degree of third-party assurance to the board. And indeed, in fact, probably 2 or 3 of those, there was reporting to ministers and indeed the Prime Minister. But on top of that, there were a number of areas where we also sought independent assurance in relation to benchmarking about what we're doing. And diversity standards one clear example of that. So, for example, around disability, we ensured that we worked with the Business Disability Forum about looking and benchmarking about where we were and how board could take assurance about the work which was being done within the organisation. Now, that's pretty manageable in an organisation of 4,500 people with a large governance structure. What if you go to the other end of the scale? So I'm a trustee of a charity which provides accommodation and support and life skills training to adults with learning disabilities. We're probably a medium-sized charity in terms of turnover. It's about £6 or £7 million. And we're supported by a rare breeds centre and a tourist attraction, basically, which helps both the training of the people we support, but also provides income. Now, that small organisation is currently under the purview of 13 regulators. It was 14, but we dropped one off when we gave up the zoo licence, interestingly enough. And the challenge there is, how does board get its independent third-party assurance with a small governance budget, with a range of areas which need to be covered, without going through clearly a form of risk assessment in its own right about what and where do we need to know things from? So that's, I think, I would sort of regard as the relatively formulaic way of doing it. But to that, I'd add some sort of less structured forms of third-party assurance which can come to a board. Firstly, there's the peer assessment. So a peer body, not necessarily exactly in the same sector, maybe. Do you have the confidence and can you bring them in to your organisation to review practices and procedures? And when do you do that? And again, a practical example, at UK Anti-Doping, 3 years ago, we established an arrangement for covert human intelligence sources, old money, that's informants. We had to do that with a statutory set of arrangements because we weren't able to get the legislation. So therefore, as a policy decision, board put in place the procedures which would enable us to manage human sources. But that needed to be subject of oversight. Where did we get that oversight from? Well, we looked to a peer body who was the best body to provide advice around covert human intelligence sources, the National Crime Agency, and therefore the National Crime Agency came in to do the review and to provide the third-party assurance. So I think that's quite a handy way of engaging on this. Next, there's peer review. So very common in law enforcement that during the course of a major or crime investigation or serious crime investigation, an independent person coming in to review the status of that inquiry and the procedures and practices in place. And that's very helpful, and can be transposed to other critical incidents or where there are issues of serious public concern. I think that's less likely to be applied to some other organisations, but where I have seen it is, where has something gone wrong? How do you bring in an individual to provide the learning and the assurance to the board about what may need to be done and what has been done? And I think more often than not, where I've seen it, that's been in relation to human resource issues. The next one is about preparing for regulatory inspections. Do you want to get ahead of the regulator? Do you want to, as a board, take some assurance that things are pretty much okay back in the operational environment? And then the fourth area I'd pick up on is about the role of the board itself in taking an independent view and oversight and assessment of what's going on. And an example here for me is about going out to stakeholders. At UK Anti-Doping, we put in place for our 167 governing bodies across 4 countries in terms of sport, put in place an assurance framework a few years ago. As part of that, we saw the quid pro quo as engagement with the board anti-doping leads there. And my point was about pushing our board members out to engage with those board anti-doping leads, to get from them their views on the assurance framework, its operation, and how we as an organisation were operating. So in this case, the third-party assurance has come from the board itself by reaching out and having conversations with interested parties and stakeholders. So altogether, I'd say that external assurance offers several benefits. There's the accountability and the transparency element, which I think is really important. In the corporate world, increasingly there are demands for greater transparency to a level at which internal teams can't give the degree of confidence that many people might want. And I think that picks up on stakeholder trust, investor trust, etc. And subsequently down the line about any due diligence practices which may need to be put in place on the organisation. Then you've got meeting of regulatory expectations. We know increasingly there are regulators looking at us, UK Corporate Governance Code, Financial Reporting Council standards, etc. Independent insurance is an important part of that. And I think being able to describe some of the third-party assurance which takes place, or the board commission, in your governance statement with the annual report should give a degree of confidence to those who have an interest in the organisation or the delivery of the service required. And then it strengthens stakeholder confidence. So whether it's about independent verification of financial health, cybersecurity, environmental compliance to investors, stakeholders, and from my perspective, a really important one, the public and the public who use our services. So that's all well and good. Some experiences and considerations about obtaining external board assurance. It isn't always easy in terms of the resource, the governance support within the organisation. And if you're a small organisation, knowing what areas you fundamentally want third-party assurance for. I think that takes me back in a loop to, what are the strategic risks to the organisation the board are concerned about, and what's the board's risk appetite, and where do they therefore want this additional and external consideration to take place. So you need to, I think, operate and commission on a risk basis, and the work which needs to be undertaken needs to be done on a proportionate basis, both in terms of finance, but also intrusion into the organisation. Then there is a need to be diligent in the selection of the third-party providers, ensuring that, giving you that third-party assurance. If they're out of date in terms of their own practice and procedure, then it can go wrong. And I have seen examples where external assurance has taken place, and when the regulator comes in, it's found to be a gap in terms of the knowledge of the earlier experts, and that's a challenge. So there's always a need to make sure that you're on top of those who you're commissioning to do this work. The other, I think, important thing is about engaging with the findings. This isn't a compliance tick box exercise. If there are findings and recommendations and issues which arise from the assurance, then there's a duty and obligation on the board to make sure those recommendations are dealt with, and to make sure there are action plans, and then you come back to it as a whole. And I think there's been, from my experience, some useful engagement with senior independent non-executive directors, the SIDs, in taking a role on that and holding the board's feet to the fire, pretty much along with the chair, about making sure that those matters are dealt with. So in conclusion, gaining external assurance is important for board stewardship, and I think that's what we're all here to do and agree on. So in a complex business environment, in an increasingly complex public sector environment, we need to make sure that we're able to demonstrate that. Where does it sit with the ecosystem, with the regulators, the stakeholders, the organisation and the public? But I think it's they are valuable tools in helping us discharge our board responsibilities. I hope that was useful, and I wish you well for the rest of your discussions.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Yeah, you definitely got something. I don't know if anyone else felt a little shiver down their spine whenever Trevor said that they was on the board of an organisation subject to 13 regulators, because I definitely haven't got ranked up to 13, but I think the regulatory burden and the being aware of what's to come when you know one of those inspections is coming is quite significant on the board. And I guess if you're like me, and when you became a non-exec, you realise, compared to the work that you might have done as an executive or in other roles before, you are collectively responsible for that organisation and personally liable, but you're not involved in the detail. So actually, this is a really important aspect of, how do you gain that assurance? And hopefully this discussion will aid us all in thinking that through. Thank you so much, Trevor. I really appreciate you introducing the topic. So we've got 3 questions for you to consider, and Trevor's helped us come up with these questions. So we're going to take a few minutes to just pause and reflect on the questions, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. So let me share my screen. And there you go. So the questions: when have you had to seek external assurance? Or when do you foresee that you might need to? Is your board culturally open to seeking outside assurance, even then when they're not required to? How would you go about finding the right individual and making sure they're independent to give external assurance? So feel free to just take a few quiet minutes now to reflect on your views. So a few minutes now.